Hi there, I'm Stephanie Ruhle, live at MSNBC headquarters here in New York City. It's Monday, January 24th. Let's get smarter. This morning, President Biden considering a major escalation in the standoff between Russia and the West over Ukraine, potentially sending thousands of U.S. troops, warships, and aircrafts right to Vladimir Putin's doorstep. It is one of a number of options the president was given while meeting with his national security team at Camp David, all with the goal of forcing Putin to reverse course. A decision from the White House could come as early as this week. Secretary of State Blinken is meeting virtually with members of the European Union right now as the United States is trying to coordinate its next move with our overseas allies. And while all of that is going on, the administration is not taking any chances with the Americans still inside Ukraine, ordering diplomats' families to start leaving the embassy and giving the diplomats themselves the green light to come home. Let's discuss and bring in NBC's Josh Lederman covering the White House, Matt Bradley inside Ukraine, Matt Bodner in Moscow covering the Russian side, and Joel Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Josh, let's start at the White House. How close are we actually to sending troops, real troops, to Eastern Europe?
Closer than we were just a few days ago, Stephanie. President Biden huddling over the weekend with his national security team while at Camp David. He was briefed via secure video conference by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin about potential options to shore up U.S. Military resources in the region, including, according to our colleague Courtney Kuby, the possibility of flying bomber flights over the region, as well as ship visits to the Black Sea, and also moving equipment and also potentially U.S. troops into Poland, into Romania, other neighboring countries, as the U.S. Tries to show what the potential military costs for Vladimir Putin would be if he launches this invasion that is so feared across the West right now. I think we should say that over the last few days, we've seen a real shift in tone from the Biden administration, which just, a week or two ago was really focused on the diplomatic avenue, even talking about what we could potentially give to Russia if negotiations with them over some type of resolution were to come to fruition. Now, the U.S. is still publicly leaving the door open to diplomacy, with Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, saying over the weekend that that is still the preferred option and one that is available to President Putin. But the emphasis now from the Biden administration, at least publicly, really is on showing what the potential military costs would be, as well as working with our allies to make sure military resources would be available in short order, given the possibility of an invasion that the U.S. says now could be imminent. Stephanie.
Mr. Bodner, warships, aircrafts, troops, that's no kind of diplomacy I have ever heard of. What's the Kremlin saying about all this?
Stephanie, they don't seem too happy about it. We actually heard from the Kremlin press secretary not too long ago giving his daily briefing, and he said that it's the United States, it's NATO that is responsible for inflaming tensions right now in Europe. They're essentially taking no responsibility for the situation that we're all in right now. We also saw in this daily briefing some kind of concerning claims that they're seeing, that the Russians are seeing evidence of Ukrainian preparations for an attack on eastern Ukraine. And all of these talking points, I have to say, are the kind of things that I personally am looking out for as we try to gauge what Russia might do, when they might do it. It's kind of anecdotal, but just in conversations with Russians over the past few days, they're all telling me it's impossible for Russia to go to war with Ukraine. And in a sense, that is true. Russia cannot just openly go to war with Ukraine, cannot launch the kind of invasion that they look poised to launch, because they need it to be defensive. So when you hear the Kremlin saying it looks like NATO is staging preparing for provocations, the United States is sending troops to threaten us, that the Ukrainians are threatening eastern Ukraine, those are concerning statements, because, again, it has to be painted as defensive. And if President Putin wants to do this, it's essentially what he needs.
Okay, but Joel, statements from the Kremlin talking to Russians. Why should we believe anything we hear from them? We had all these diplomatic talks last week, and at the same time, we're hearing about this plot to install a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. Like, are we kidding ourselves? Just last week, Gary Kasparov was saying, when you deal with Putin, that's like basically having diplomatic talks with a terrorist. It's a joke.
Well, Stephanie, I think you answered it yourself. We shouldn't believe them. We shouldn't be buying into the Russian disinformation right now. Russia has amassed 100,000 troops alongside Ukraine's border. It illegally invaded Ukraine 7 years ago. It's occupying parts of Ukraine and is threatening to undermine its government from within, as you just described. So those might be good talking points for international consumption intended to undermine our alliance with our partners in Europe. But that's not going to work. And that's where the diplomacy is coming in, where the United States is working with our allies to ensure that they understand that if there is a need to put punishing sanctions on Russia, that the U.S. will backfill those and support the European countries who may get impacted by those sanctions. So this is muscular diplomacy, the ramping up of deterrence alongside it, as Josh is reporting and as others are noting. That's a critical component of this, to try to send a message to Putin to sharpen the choice for him, that this will be very costly if he moves in.
Then, Mr. Bradley, let's ignore these talking points and take us to the Ukraine. You are on the ground. That is the other side of the world from where I'm sitting. What is going on there, and why should people in the United States care?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about ignoring those talking points, Ukrainians are kind of ignoring those talking points. And one of the most remarkable things about walking around here in Kiev is how quiet it is, how not panicked it is. There aren't convoys of cars leaving the city, and nobody's headed west. This is not really seen as a big deal, and that's because a lot of people here, for one thing, they kind of think that Putin is bluffing and that he won't actually invade. But another is that Ukrainians I've talked to remind me that this country has been at war for the past 8 years in the Donbass region in the east. This is not new for Ukrainians, but the buildup, the drums of war here are being heard from a distance. You don't hear them here. And that's because Ukrainians really feel like they're not involved. They don't have any purchase on this situation. They've been left out of a lot of the diplomacy up until now. And really, this is just fulfilling a long-time frustration of a lot of Ukrainians who are tired of Russia using their country as a cudgel to beat the West. And that is what they've seen ever since before World War II, that they've seen themselves as an instrument of Moscow rather than as a country of their own. And while, Moscow is using Ukraine against the West, they think the West doesn't really care about them. They're tired of being mere spectators for their own fate. Stephanie?
Joel, here's what I don't get. Russia is not a superpower. They're an economic midget. The White House is threatening major stuff, huge economic consequences, military, so much. Why is none of this scaring Putin?
Well, Stephanie, Putin wants to reestablish spheres of influence outside of Russia's borders. He's been doing this for a couple of decades. He went into Chechnya when he took over power 20-plus years ago. He has bombed into Syria. He has been pushing the boundaries as far as he can to reestablish what was once the great empire. And for him personally, he is extremely rich, billions of dollars. It's alleged that he has in accounts around the world. So he doesn't care about the Russian people. This is not a question about Russia's population feeling the pain and whether or not that harms his standing. He really cares about reestablishing a bigger, greater Russia. And so for him, the cost won't be felt personally, which is why the sanctions components that the United States and Europe is looking at have to target not just him, but the cronies around him to ensure that they understand this is costly to them as well.
The most important point, Vladimir Putin is allegedly a multi-billionaire. He doesn't care if the Russian people starve. Thank you guys so much. Really, really important. I appreciate you joining us. We've got to